Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 183. Today we're talking about Visual Studio Code. We are your hosts this week, Justin Ribeiro and Danny Blue. Danny, how's it going?
It's going pretty well. To carry on with my latest drone things, I did, in fact, buy a bigger drone. I flew it outside. Also, I got a puppy.
I'm hoping the puppy's not flying on the drone yet.
It's fine. The puppy loves the drone. Don't worry about it. She thinks it's great.
Puppies love everything. That's the joy of puppies. As long as they're not chewing on it at that point.
No, but we're doing pretty good. We've slept through the night twice now in our warm, comfortable crate, so that is very good for my wife and I.
You know, they say web development's hard. Then you get a puppy, and then it just all goes downhill from there.
Absolutely.
So speaking of the web, Leon is still on vacation, so we're going to throw it over to Danny this week, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Danny?
Thank you, Justin. The first stable release of Lit HTML and Lit Element have landed on NPM. Feels like a long time since we first heard about these two really cool libraries. It's very exciting to see them finally hit 1.0, and congratulations to the team. Dynamic imports are now enabled in Firefox Nightly. The MDN Product Advisory Board met in New York in January. Highlights include 13.3 million monthly users and a 21% year-over-year user growth. The full meeting notes are available on GitHub. Trusted Web Activity has landed in Chrome for Android 72, allowing you to integrate your web content and PWAs into your Android app in a trusted manner. What does this mean? That means that it is now possible to put PWAs in the Play Store. It's not extremely straightforward how to make this happen, but we will make sure there's a link in the show notes so that you can start experimenting with it. Back to you, Justin.
Thank you, Danny. Some interesting stuff this week. We're getting into February now, which means I expect everyone to do daily releases. I think that's what we all need. More patches, people. But today we're not talking about patches, though you can write your patch in this tool. Today we're talking about Visual Studio Code, and it's my honor to introduce our guest this week, Kenneth. How's it going?
Good. Hey there. Thank you for having me. So
long time no see.
Yeah, it's been quite a while. I kind of been hiding up here in Redmond, being busy with VS Code. So,
Kenneth, for folks out there who don't know you, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell them a little bit about you.
A bit about myself. Kenneth Auchenberg, originally born in Copenhagen, Denmark. Been working on the web platform on and off on various different projects for the past, I would say, 10 years. I've kind of been involved with various browser-related things or front-end related things. Been doing a lot of work in the DevTools space, especially around DevTools protocols or remote debugging protocols. And that was kind of the way I ended up at Microsoft. So I've been 3 years at Microsoft now, been involved with Edge DevTools, mobile DevTools, a lot of JavaScript-related things. And for the past years, I've been on the VS Code team.
You've been on the web a long time. We've run into each other over the years at various events and speaking things and standards things. You of a lot of people we know, you really love the web. I feel like you are up there in the love of web sort of hierarchy of things, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I have a passion for the web platform, and I want the web to win.
And you found yourself in a bit of a strange situation a week or so ago about the grand Mozilla Chromium thing that seemed to have gotten taken out of context into a whole bunch of clickbaity articles. I felt bad because I know that was just your opinion of the situation as opposed to some official stance.
Yeah, I basically tweeted a personal opinion about what I believe that the web platform needs to do going forward, that we need to have more consolidation about our engines. And I would say some of my tweets were taken out of context and that turned into a whole different conversation. But I think us as everyone that is building the web and is passionate about the web, I think we need to have a constructive conversation and try to mobilize a lot of the passion we all have for browser engines and browsers, platforms. We need to mobilize that into a constructive dialogue. And what do we really think that the web needs to be successful? And that's basically in the perspective of, we have many other application platforms out there, Native, Flutter, React Native, all these other platforms and ecosystems out there. They really don't care about the web. They want to win. And if we really want the web to win, my personal opinion is that we need to have a joint effort where we build the web together, instead of what I called in my tweets parallel universes. But that's a whole different discussion, and I really hope that's a conversation we, as everyone in the web community, can have together, because there's so much passion and so much energy around the web. It's just sad that sometimes we are fighting each other instead of working with each other.
Yeah, it is unfortunate. We sometimes hold on to things a little bit too strongly, which I find gets everybody in trouble, and then we don't move things forward, and that's too bad. But speaking of moving things forward, we need to talk about Visual Studio Code, because quite frankly, I can't kind of live without it at this point. Talk about things consolidating towards a thing that I never thought would happen. I know Danny and I talk about this a lot just on the side. VS Code has come a long way very quickly. Talk a little bit about VS Code. How did you, and you worked on protocols before, under the hood, VS Code has some amazing stuff. How did you get involved and help propel VS Code so far forward?
Well, I think, what have I been now on the team? 1.5 years. So I haven't been on the team for quite a while, but at the same time, overall VS Code is still a fairly relatively young product, right? My journey to Microsoft is really as I was alluding to before, the work I've been doing in the Standards community around DevTools protocols and driving unification on that. And basically that caught Microsoft attention. So I ended up joining Microsoft to basically look at the mobile web developer tooling market from a strategic perspective, and trying to propose a few strategies on what we could do as Microsoft there. And one of the things we did originally was actually building a browser debugger, Chrome debugger for VS Code. So VS Code was out there. I think VS Code at that point in time didn't have any tabs or anything. It was one of the first releases. And we started exploring what we could do, and basically taking concepts of browser dev tools and putting that into VS Code. And then the Chromium the Chrome debugger for VS Code kind of exploded in usage. And it's now one of the most popular extensions we have for VS Code. That was frankly how I found my way to the team. And the VS Code team is a relatively small team in Microsoft. It's not we have hundreds of people working on VS Code. So it's more people that contribute to VS Code and build successful things in the ecosystem is kind of how we also get people more directly involved with VS Code. And VS Code, I think, has really gained a lot of momentum in the community. We're seeing an incredible adoption across a lot of different languages. But I think the story about VS Code is interesting, and that's something we can go into detail about, because I think that's a story that hasn't really been told more broadly.
So one question that I have right off pretty much right off the bat is why does Visual Studio Code exist? So it's been especially at the time it was announced, it was a very kind of out of the ordinary move for Microsoft. It's here's an open source, web-based, web-directed code editor around the time when things like Atom and Sublime Text were reigning king. So I was curious if you have any insight into just why do we have Visual Studio Code? Because it's become, most developers I know that, web developers that I know use VS Code. And so why do I have it? Thank you, but why do I have it?
Well, if you look at the history of Visual Studio Code or VS Code, the project at Microsoft really started around an exploration effort on how or whether we could build a high-performance web-based editor. So some of you might be familiar with, we have Eric Gamma, one of our technical fellows that is really like the founding father of VS Code. He's also worked on Eclipse before, and his team is based in Switzerland, in Zurich. And his team started exploring ways to basically build a high-performance text editor, and that project is called Monaco, and it's a reference point to Monaco is Code Mirror. So his team enabled Monaco, and then it was really like an exploration from there in terms of, hey, where can we then put Monaco? And the first project that I'm familiar with that was adopted by Monaco was actually a new web-based editor for Azure. So if you went to the Azure and you deployed your Node app to Azure App Service, then the first product that was built around Monaco was a web-based editor where you could edit your JavaScript files directly in the editor. And the learning back then was that, hey, it's cool that you have a browser-based editor that only works with JavaScript, but no one was really using it because it was a limited extension model. You could only write JavaScript as because it's running inside the browser. So the product team back then slowly pivoted away from the browser model and saying, hey, we have some really interesting technology that is high performant and it's a great experience. Can we apply that to a different audience? And that was where the journey on Visual Studio Code started, of building a standalone editor. And then from there, the project has kind of accelerated that we now have a full-blown product called VS Code. We have a massive developer ecosystem around us. And from a pure strategic perspective, what we're doing with VS Code is, first of all, we're building a great open source product, but we're also paving the way for introducing developer services to developers out there. So if you open VS Code and you're an Azure user, you can install Azure extensions to make sure that you can deploy your Azure functions, do deployments, management, all these things. So that's kind of like the short story of VS Code. And it's actually funny, I did a talk in Hong Kong over the holidays, over the Christmas holidays, exactly about this, actually telling the story on how VS Code pivoted from being a web-based thing to a standalone product.
So I actually think it's, I don't know if you'll have the answer to this, but I'm curious why it's called Visual Studio Code. And that actually seems like a pretty bold choice to me. Like, I know this is, like this, most people probably don't care, but, like even to, when you think about Visual Studio, again, especially at that time, like, like at least for me, Visual Studio was not a positive. I had not had positive experiences with Visual Studio up to that point. So it seemed like a bold choice to be like, hey, web devs, come use this one thing that your C# friends have been talking, and .NET friends have been talking to you about all this time.
Like I don't have the specific insights. I cannot speak on behalf of decisions that were made before my time on the team. But if you think about what we as Microsoft are offering, is that we have the tooling division, Dev inside Microsoft, and we have a family of products, right? We call that the Visual Studio family. So we have Visual Studio, that is our IDE. We have Visual Studio for Mac, that is our Mac IDE, and then we have VS Code, that is our editor, right? So it's really like the way we look at the market is that we see like the tooling space as a spectrum where you have editors on one side of the spectrum and IDEs on the other side. And we want to make sure that we offer developer tools to the full spectrum, regardless of what your needs are. And I think that was also like the clear market research back then was, hey, like we kind of have been doing pretty well in the IDE space. But in the editor space, we haven't really done any product there, right?
Well, I figured Notepad. I mean, Notepad really had the web dev market, about 10 years ago, and then we kind of all moved forward. Yeah, well, it's kind of, I say it in jest, but it's true, right? Like a lot of people started out in the early days of things just in Notepad. That was what you had, and that's what you used. And it's nice to see, to some extent, a massive progression of things that have made sort of developer life better, because you talk about the Visual Studio sort of family of tools. Visual Studio I've always had pretty good luck with Visual Studio as an IDE. I've built Chrome with it, numerous times over the years. And there's lots of, very nice, useful tooling out there. And really a lot of the niceness that somewhat was maybe confusing in the Visual Studio thing for folks who've never used an IDE before. VS Code really smooths out a lot of the debugging problems we had before, a lot of the extension problems that you mentioned before. The extension subsystem in VS Code is just amazing, as someone who's been working on extensions a lot over the last 6 months.
Yeah, if I take a step back on that, if I look at my own journey, why I ended up at Microsoft, is that my story and how I got started with development was like in the good old days. I was doing like VB script and classic ASP, and then I got into the Microsoft ecosystem. Then I did a bit of .NET, was using VS, and then I kind of left the Microsoft ecosystem to go open source, to Ruby, Node, and then basically left the Microsoft ecosystem. And the reason why I ended up back at Microsoft is that if I look at Microsoft is a developer focused company, and it's hard. And like Microsoft is one of the biggest tooling vendors out there that understands what it means to build great tools. And I think what we're doing with VS Code is that we are showing the world that Microsoft can be relevant for a new audience, but also we have so much experience in building great tools we can apply to other languages and other runtimes than just .NET, right? And to me, that's an interesting bit because if I look at like on my personal mission, like I think fundamentally software is too complicated, that we need to empower many more people to build software. And in particular, when we look at the web platform, I think there's been a massive disconnect, and there still is a massive disconnect between our authoring tools and our debugging tools. I think we've come quite far with browser dev tools, but an aspect of our authoring has been that people have been in Notepad++, they've been in Sublime Text, etc. And there's so many things we can do and take from the more managed side of the world and bring that to the web platform. And we really need to build great tools for the web in order for the web to succeed. Because if you look at what really the competitor landscape out there, instead of you building a PWA for the web, maybe you want to build a Flutter app, or you want to build an iOS app, an Android app, or a WeChat mini app. There's many alternatives out there that actually has a better development experience on the web platform.
So another thing that I'm very curious about with Visual Studio Code is it seems we went through in that editor space, we went through a couple, I don't know, eras maybe. So you went from using something like Notepad++, which was really very, very limited, to things like Atom or Sublime Text. Really before that, there were also Bear, but let you build things up. So like everybody had their own favorite Sublime Text configuration. They're like, oh, these are the plugins that you should install. That was really about it. VS Code seems like maybe a little bit more than that. It gives you some things right out of the box, but still has this rich plugin ecosystem. I'm curious how, for something like Visual Studio Code, how you decide what it should do out of the box. Like, should it, like the fact that it has, like TypeScript and stuff like that, support out of the box, and other languages too. How do you decide what gets shipped with the product versus what you should say? It's like, oh, well, we will release a plugin for that, or the community will do it, which was the popular way of handling it at the time.
If you look at into the core VS Code and how the product is built, is basically the foundation is our rich extension model. And if you look at the history of VS Code, the first audience VS Code went after was the JavaScript developer, mainly focused around the full stack developer. So that's why VS Code ships with a great HTML and CSS experience, but also the built-in TypeScript experience and a built-in Node debugger. But if you look at VS Code today, VS Code is much more diverse than just JavaScript, and that really speaks to the extension model. So if you look at like what ships inside the box, is all about what is core to the workload that we prioritize, and that is JavaScript and web development. And And everything else is really powered by a rich extension ecosystem. And if something can ship as an extension and be recommended to you as a user, that's our preferred, more modular approach to things. And as we look at VS Code, we are taking an approach where saying, hey, like maybe we ship some features, maybe they should be optional going forward. Because today, if you use VS Code with Python or use it with Go, maybe you don't need a great HTML experience. And that's also the why that if in VS Code today, you can actually go in and disable built-in extensions, and you can even uninstall them if you don't need them. So it really speaks to like the extension model and the modular approach that VS Code is taking to things. And if you use VS Code for JavaScript, you have a whole different set of extensions that if you do machine learning with TensorFlow.
That's cool. I didn't know that you could disable some of the built-in bits. That's pretty cool.
So if you think about the extension model and what really is powering VS Code, you can think about that spectrum. If you think about the editor and the IDE, then VS Code ships with a built-in set of extensions that gives you like what we consider like the baseline, how we want an editor to be. But if you don't want IntelliSense, auto-completion, refactoring capabilities, you can just disable the TypeScript language server, and then you can kind of like simplify your VS Code experience. And if you want like the full or a more capable IDE-like experience, you can install a range of extensions that drags like VS Code towards the IDE experience. So it's really up to you on how you can customize the experience.
From a sort of plugin based web sort of experience, we talk about, sort of the ecosystem that the web has these days between lots and lots of libraries and the frameworks that folks are generally familiar with, your Reacts and Views of the world and whatnot. VS Code has really made developing for a lot of the web ecosystem of tooling significantly easier these days. Building an extension that is rich in feature sets that plugs directly into sort of that modularity that VS Code offers seems to be a huge selling point with a lot of folks sort of downstream in the ecosystem, where we are sort of taking out the gaps of that sort of those friction points where, hey, how do I actually debug this thing? Or, hey, how do I get IntelliSense to actually function? Which was always kind of burdensome in other places. Like, it didn't make a lot of sense, but building those sort of tools on top of VS Code is actually significantly easier, wouldn't you say?
And well, like I think it really speaks to like the modularity and also the extension model, right? Like VS Code has a node-based extension API that allows you to interact with a lot of different components in VS Code, but we also have like two aspects that are protocol-based extensions. So we have something that is called the language server protocol, and we have the debug adapter protocol. The language server protocol is really like a protocol that you use to implement a language server for a particular language that VS Code can understand. So when you open up a JavaScript file in VS Code, what really happens is that VS Code in its core doesn't know anything about JavaScript, but it starts up the TypeScript language server that analyzes the TypeScript/JavaScript code and then provides the diagnostics and all the insights back to VS Code that then VS Code lights up in the UI. The same is applicable for Go, Ruby, etc. And I think that protocol has really enabled a rich ecosystem of languages to be built. And even you as a VS Code extension, you can kind of build on top of that language server integration. And the same on the debugging side, like I was mentioning before, one of my first projects was doing a Chromium debugger, so you can debug Chrome targets from VS Code. And that is really basically a protocol adapter that translates the Chrome DevTools protocol to the debug adapter protocol. And I think what we've seen for the overall tooling ecosystem is that we have seen both the language server protocol, the LSP, and the debug adapter protocol, the DAP, being adopted by other tools. So you can install a plugin for Vim that gives you LSP support. You can do the same for Sublime, etc. So it's really about like how a lot of investments in the overall tooling communities basically being consolidated, being built on top of the same protocols, so we can kind of reuse our investments.
So I have a little bit of a sidebar here. So you've mentioned the term language server a couple of times already. Can you give, so for folks that might not know actually what that is, can you give a very brief definition of what we mean?
Yeah, so a language server is a piece of code that analyzes your code and provides information, reasoning about the code you have opened that's being analyzed back to the editor. And the integration between the editor and the language server is something we call the language server protocol. And that is capabilities in the language server protocol saying, hey, I'm on this particular line. Can you give me autocomplete items for this particular object? Can you give me refactoring capabilities, etc.? So it's really like a standardized way that code analyzers can provide insights back to the editor.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, I was rather shocked how easy it was to get into that. So I'd worked a little bit on the lit HTML sort of language service and plugin sort of stuff with Matt, who works on VS Code, and it took me very little time to sort out exactly how you set up your debugging environment, how you test that language service, and just how easy that language service plugs into other things. Like, you know, we're talking about VS Code now, but to your point, like you can use those language services with Sublime's TypeScript plugin or Atom's TypeScript plugin stuff. Like it all is a much more standard set of tooling that seems to be flowing outward. And it's if you know a little TypeScript and you knew how to build things, like it is pretty easy to get started. It didn't take much time at all.
Yeah, like I think me personally, like given that I spent quite some time looking into like standards and trying to unify DevTools protocols and stuff, like I think a lot of principles and philosophy and how we have been doing things with VS Code really resonates with me personally. And that's also like why I think it's really interesting when we start looking at tooling for the web, that we can start bringing some of the DevTools experiences into the editor. Because my personal mission is that I still think like our authoring workflow and how we build for the web is completely broken. It's crazy how we do some stuff over in the editor and then we switch to DevTools and we kind of tap our day away, right? And I think we're starting to scratch the surface of what we can do for the web platform as a whole, both with bringing debugging inside the editor, but also like over the holidays when I was preparing my talk for VS Code, I also did my browser preview extension that is kind of bringing a browser preview from a headless Chrome instance directly inside VS Code you can debug and interact with. And I think some of the things there are really interesting, especially when we start thinking about like, what if I could have a virtual device lab so I can see like 5 different phones at the same time as I'm developing, and I can validate that my experience actually works. I think there's a lot of things we need to do to optimize our inner loop and the workflow we have for the web.
You mentioned browser preview, and you and I had talked about this offline previously about things like browser preview and bringing tools in, because I had written some Lighthouse hooking so that you could do Lighthouse sort of testing out of VS Code without actually leaving VS Code. Browser preview uses Chromium headless, which is, people who know me know I'm a bit of a fan. You know, I may maintain some things around that, you know, that people use. Building that kind of experience was somewhat beyond, was out of our reach from a platform standpoint for a long time. Like we did not have the necessary pieces. And I know obviously you've worked on the DevTools protocol side for a long time. And do you think that with things like headless Chrome, I mean, Firefox is technically also has a headless mode now. Ideally, that'll have some sort of meshing along the lines of the same thing as Chrome Developer or DevTools protocol. Do you think that those protocols, which allow us to build developer tools in things like VS Code, are almost there, or are we still a long ways away?
That's actually a good question. I think the beauty about the web is that we can constantly evolve the platform. I still think we have still a lot of work ahead of us in trying to refine the workflow. But I think overall we've come a pretty long way, that if you use Chrome debugging with VS Code and you have browser DevTools or Chrome DevTools open in Chrome, you can actually do step-by-step, side-by-side debugging. Everything is integrated. You can install browser preview that is still like an exploration of what would possible. You can bring a virtual device screencast from headless Chrome inside the editor, and you can have everything on one screen. I think we're starting to scratch the surface of what's possible with a more efficient workflow by integrating the tools. But personally, what I would like to see is like more in-depth integration between browser dev tools and the editor. Why is it that if I open the command palette in VS Code, why don't I have access to all the commands that I have over in Chrome DevTools or Firefox DevTools? If I click on open a file from the DOM Explorer inside DevTools, why can't it just say open inside my preferred editor? I think there's a lot of things, small nits in the workflow we need to optimize before like before having really an optimal experience. And I think there's a lot of things we've taken for granted on how the current development workflow is. So we just, this is the way it is. But really where we are today is that we can start challenging those assumptions and refine the experience. And like on the protocol side, I think we've made significant progress on that we now have a W3C Web Incubator group where we're discussing protocol standardization, but we don't have a standard yet. We have a proposal for a spec. So I still think that's a long way to go before we can say we have an official API. But in these days, when we talk about standards, then we can kind of have de facto standards, and then we can have official specs. By the end of the day, as long as the ecosystem is agile, then you could argue how much there actually needs to be explicitly written in the spec before it provides value, right?
Do you feel that VS Code has really used that agile nature to sort of stay ahead of the curve at this point? Because it seems to me that every time the release notes come out, which, by the way, if there's an award for release notes for things, VS Code I might win the award for release notes. Like the release notes are always amazing.
Oh, I always get very excited when the little icon pops up saying that there's a new release. I always get excited because I get to just go line by line. It's like, oh, what do I get now? My favorite one is when you fix the Linux issue with the header, so that it was used the custom header for the Linux version. That was one of my favorite things.
Speaking of that, while we have been recording this podcast, we just shipped a new release of VS Code. So
what?
You're just sitting there pushing the release button. You're like, everyone roll them out.
Yeah. So we actually just had in our channel here that people were pressing the button. So we just released, and like definitely like I think given how we as VS Code is operating, and that's really like a team effort, right? Like everyone at Agile, we are constantly monitoring social media and being reactive on GitHub. And we also have a large community around VS Code helping us on GitHub that we ship every day. Like we ship if you use the Insiders edition of VS Code, that is like the green icon, then you get an update every morning. And that's really our master build that we internally on the VS Code team is using. We use the Insiders edition of VS Code that is built every day to build the next version of VS Code. There's a lot of inception going on there. And every month we ship out a new release. And we take pride in making sure that we have elaborate release notes talking about what we do. We're also fully transparent with our iteration plans, our testing strategies. All these things are fully documented on GitHub, right? So we were kind of showing like how you can also operate a product with full transparency. And I think so far we've been doing a good job on trying to just chalk on and ship great things. And we just getting started here, right?
It strikes me as fairly amazing because you've mentioned that it's a fairly small team at Microsoft still working on Visual Studio Code, but the community that's grown around it has been just absolutely huge. It seems like, again, it seems to be one of those things that, oh, I wonder if I could make an update, and then you go to find documentation on actually how to make a pull request into VS Code. The documentation is really, really good. Like it takes very little effort to spin things up. To be able to contribute back into it. The community is continuing to grow, though. I would imagine at this point. I mean, the tracker seems to be. I've seen your tweets with your screenshot of, oh, here's my current status on GitHub of things I need to read. I mean, you guys are really on top of it.
Well, like it's really about like passion and distributing the workload between all of us on the team, right? But we kind of take turns of being an inbox tracker. So one person is responsible for keeping an eye on like GitHub, another person is responsible for keeping an eye on the social media account, right? And like Yes, we're definitely growing with our community. We're getting a lot of community PRs. We're getting a lot of issues every day that we need to triage, etc. So it's a learning experience for I think everyone involved. Last year we were the most contributed project on GitHub per the October's universe report. So it's great to see that people have interest in contributing, helping out with the VS Code project, right? And also like VS Code as a core team is small, but even internally at Microsoft, even like at other companies, there's teams dedicated to building extensions on top, right? So the VS Code team, for example, is not building our Python extension, but we have a Python language team that is building that's a set of Python extensions that the Python community needs to light up a great Python experience inside VS Code. So it's really like this modular approach that also allows like decentralized teams just to be spun up and building their things on top.
Well, and the quality shows. I think that's the key for, again, most of the value that at least I've seen is that if you can iron out the workflow of people who are actually writing in those languages, as opposed to, Justin randomly going through and going, you know what, I'm making a language service on a thing I don't understand. There's a lot of value in that, right? They have a pulse on a different set of community than necessarily the core team. Do you, I mean, it seems to me that scales fairly well. I mean, it seems that a new language sort of pops up in the VS Code ecosystem all the time these days. Do you find that because there are so many language services being built that it's hard to sort of hone down breaking changes, things that you really want to do in the language service? Because I know I've seen chit chat about, particularly in the web component space, so like, hey, I would very much like TypeScript to understand this, but the language service thing doesn't do this at this point, which I won't get into at this point because that's a little deep. But you get the general gist. Do you find that it's hard to continuously improve when there are so many things relying on it at this point? Like, how are you guys dealing with that?
Well, like on the principles levels is about introducing the right abstractions in the community and continue to rinse and repeat those abstractions, whether those are language server protocol or the debugger adapter protocol or the extension API service we introduced in VS Code. I think the great thing we have seen with the language server protocol, I cannot speak on behalf of the engineers responsible for our LSP, is that but what we have seen is that we have seen adoption from other companies. So we're seeing Google building a Go language server. We're seeing Apple building a language server for Swift and their C++ or C-based languages. We're basically seeing adoption of the protocol across the industry. So everyone is kind of like getting their hands dirty with the concepts and providing feedback back to the language server repository with their use cases and ideas, right? So it's really like a cross-industry collaborative effort. And even internally at Microsoft, like our language server protocol, our debug adapter protocol is now integrated in both Visual Studio and VS Code. So even internally, we have a lot of interesting use cases we're seeing bubbling up. And of course, it's like, as with growing any product, is about like managing like your feedback channels and finding the right balance and what kind of input that you need to listen to and what you absolutely shouldn't listen to, right? But I think overall that comes down to like being a team effort and being a much broader effort. So
cool. So one thing I always find curious curious isn't the right a thing I am curious about with projects like this, where there's a lot going on, and especially something that is this popular now, is I'm curious if you think there were any mistakes made or things that you wish had been done differently, say, a couple of years ago, that are maybe not causing problems, but you're like, oh, this would have been handy if we did it this way. Or are you saying that this is the first bit of software in all of history that's like, nope, we got it, perfect first time?
I think like I'm sure that everyone that has been involved with the VS Code project can make their own personal list of mistakes that everyone has done. I think maybe
mistakes isn't really the right word, but decisions that were made.
Well, like I think we make mistakes and this maybe bad product decisions probably on a monthly basis, and then we learn from them, and then we rinse and repeat, right? I think I like a quite visible case that what we did like last year with VS Code was our new logo. I don't know if you remember the icon gate, where we basically changed the color of our logo to be orange, and that turned out to be a disaster in terms of how the community reacted to the new color. So we had a community of people building their own icons. There's a whole saga on GitHub with like thousands of reactions that people complained about the icon. So that's a quite visible case where we made a product decision because of like some internal design constraints, etc., with our new logo, how it should look, with the colors we got from our branding teams, etc., and then we just rolled with it, and then our community exploded. But that's a good example of how we, as a product team, is listening to the community. We reverted that change, rolled back our old logo, wrote a blog post about our thought process, etc. So I definitely think along like, as we grow the product, I'm also pretty sure that some people will have strong opinions about how we are growing VS Code to support more diverse use cases. That some people probably disagree with that because I think VS Code is becoming too bloated. But it really comes down to like, I think a lot of the core principles and how we enable this modular approach, and people can disable stuff if they want to. But on top of mind, I don't think other than our icon gate, I don't think there's something that really stands out. But in hindsight, when I reflect on this a bit more, there might be a few examples that pops up.
Looking sort of forward at what VS Code is doing today, what do you sort of see on the horizon? You know, we've talked a lot about developer workflows. I agree with you immensely that I feel like a lot of our developer workflows are not great at this point, and that we need to sort of improve those things. But in VS Code land, you know, what kind of future do you all see? Like, where do you want to go with feature sets? What's those pie in the sky sort of things that, you know, you'd like to see both in the editor or even on the platform in years to come?
Like, it really depends. Like, there's a VS Code perspective of things, and then there's a web platform perspective of things. I think with VS Code, I think if you go to our wiki, we actually have our 2019 roadmap, and there's a few key things that we are working on, particularly for VS Code. So you can actually have a look, and I would encourage everyone that is listening to the podcast to go to our wiki and see our roadmap and provide feedback on it. There's a few key things there in the core VS Code. I think accessibility is a key thing for us this year, that we want to be the best editor out there. And I think that's something that we as a developer tooling community really need to prioritize to enable a much more diverse community of people being able to code and basically use our tools. I think we as an industry has not done a great job at that yet, and I think there's a lot to be done in that space. From a web platform perspective, I'm biased in my perspective, but I still think that we need to have a clear separation between the web platform and our tooling story. I think it's been too intertwined up until we got starting to get some more better, well-defined APIs in place. Personally, in a world of progressive web apps, where web apps are running in Electron shells, are running on Chrome OS, are running on Windows and phones, I still find it interesting or puzzling that we as a community still insist on shipping our browser dev tools inside the runtime, where any other runtime is a separate tool that you install. So I definitely think that from the web tooling perspective, I still think we need to have a better separation between the tools that we ship and the runtimes, and enable integration between those worlds. But that's my old mantra, and I would love to see Firefox DevTools with all the innovation that they do to actually start integrating with the editor space. What if we could have like a DOM Explorer inside the editor that would, maybe we could rethink the DOM Explorer. What is a DOM Explorer in a component world? I think there's a lot of things we can do as soon as we start iterating outside of the browser, browser, because we can be much more agile instead of being tied to like a 8 week release cycles, and we can start experimenting. And I think we deeply need like more experimentation of what web tooling could be. And I hope that with some of the things that VS Code is providing, that we can have a community that starts exploring these things.
Is the tooling too hard today? Dev tools, the whole 9 yards. I ask this question a lot. It seems like these days, in terms of sort of the developer experience of things. Do people get it? I get varied answers on this. What do you think?
Depends, right? I still think the web platform, if you think of it as an application platform, is one of the most easy platforms to get started with, because there's bootstrapping boilerplate projects out there. But if I look at the web DX of what we provide today compared to when I started building for the web, where it was like, hey, I had a strong tag, and then there's also I have a B tag, and then there's also bold text. The amount of abstractions that is needed, you need to stitch together to have a good development experience, then it's rather complicated and it's terrible, right? And I think like dev tools today, browser dev tools has kind of turned into like mini IDEs. Like the vast majority, and my personal experience from working a bit on Edge dev tools and what we did there, is that the vast majority of people are using the console and the DOM Explorer, the profiling tools, the debugger, all these other tools are not really used. So I think we could probably do a better experience in simplifying the tools that we show by default to developers, and maybe just enable specific tools for the power users. A lot of people don't understand how to profile their code, and that's perfectly all right, because that's maybe just for the platform authors and framework authors. Another interesting thing that I was just reminded of, like we actually ended up disabling dev tools in Edge by default, and introduced a developer mode, just like WebKit and Safari has. So inspect element is not enabled by default, and that was basically based on telemetry that we saw like the majority of DevTools sessions being users that opened up DevTools, and the first action they did was to close the DevTools. So they basically simply opened the DevTools by mistake. And there were some good examples of people playing a game on Facebook, and then suddenly they pressed F12 or whatever they pressed, and then DevTools were opened, and they got scared because suddenly they saw a lot of debug statements being shown to them. So I think sometimes when we look at like the whole tooling space, I think we really have like a developer focus centric on what the platform should be, and sometimes we also forget what the end user really want. And end users really don't care about tools or easy readable HTML. They just want a fast experience because they compare the web to their native Instagram app, right?
I think that's actually a really good point. Sometimes we get lost in the fact that we have a whole bunch of tools, and they are relatively easy for us to gain access to, but to the average person who may not understand what that thing is, it is rather terrifying to see. You know, by the way, people, hey, clean up your console log statements. You don't need to ship that in prod. Like,
true. No, like actually speaking of that, like a few iterations back, we shipped a debugging feature we call log points for VS Code that enables you to inject your console.logs on demand, so you never leave them in your code. And I think I just saw a tweet like last week or this week that Chrome DevTools is shipping the same feature now. They added log points too. So I definitely think that there's small features like that we can do to help people avoiding cluttering all their code and sprinkle console logs everywhere. So.
Yeah, log points is amazing. Like yeah, log points is really cool. You should try it if you have not tried it in VS Code. And this is a fair point, though. Like the reason that you see console logs scattered about places is because people don't quite understand how to use the tools either, right? You end up with that gap of, well, we have these things, and well, I remember how to use printf, so I'm gonna fall back to console log, and that'll get me there, right? Other platforms have this problem too. It just seems very acute these days because, like you said, DevTools were only a command, a key bind away from popping up and going, oh, look at all the stuff. So it gets tough. Like there is a fine line there between developer ease of experience and, oh yeah, we should not terrify people.
Absolutely, but I think just like if you look at the web platform as an application platform that can run apps, maybe if you look that through that lens, then does .NET or Java ship with DevTools built in, an IDE built in into the runtime, or is that something you install locally on your computer, right? I guess to me that's like the best comparison.
I will say that's definitely something I've never really thought. Like, I've never thought of it that way. Again, because I grew up doing web stuff, so that's just the way that I knew it. So I actually always found the opposite case where it's like, oh, I can't just hit F12 in there, solve my stuff. I always found that to be strange.
Yeah, I think that's a whole different discussion. I think there's something extremely valuable about having tools and inspectability available for the web. And is continuing to enable a lot of curious minds to kind of peek under the surface. To kind of see how the web is composed together. But like, I think my learning from actually spending some time building browser dev tools was that if you look in telemetry and actually talk to end users, there's a lot of like end users that are really scared about these tools that they open by mistake. And that was a bit surprising to me. And that was really like what led us to, let's just disable the tools by default. And both Edge and Firefox, or Safari is doing that now, right?
Well, like you said, if we have better tools that, from a desktop standpoint of the things that we're using, your Visual Studio Codes of the world and whatnot, that sort of give us that integration, from a developer perspective, your experience is still pretty good. Like, even if you maybe don't have to go check a flag or you run some other commands that bring your dev tools back in the browser, if we can smooth out those experiences between other tools we use and our editors, that ideally your developer experience doesn't just stay the same, but it actually improves. And I think if we can continue to improve the developer experience, ideally it becomes easier for people to get involved and get started on things, because at the end of the day, you shouldn't be blocked from trying to build something. But at the same time, you shouldn't have to jump through, 75 hoops to get there.
Absolutely. And that really speaks to like having like a proper extension model, and also fostering an open source community of people can be able to contribute. I think one of the most scary things I remember many years ago when I tried to contribute to Chrome DevTools is like, what? How do I do this on Chromium.org? And it was really a scary experience, right? Where if we have to take a more modular approach, and I think that's the beauty of like browser extensions, but also extensions for VS Code, is that we have these small modules people can compose and iterate on, and then maybe they will get absorbed into the core of any particular product. But I think that philosophy is really what we need to do, for all our tools. Look at like Webpack plugins, etc. All these things about layering, right?
Yeah, GitHub seems to have enabled an entirely new set of folks to come on board too, because it is interesting if you go backwards in time and sort of open source, and if you'd worked on other tools before GitHub, like, it was a scattering of very difficult things to get a patch somewhere, depending on if you were on, somebody's custom setup, or if you were on code.google.com, that used to be a thing, or SourceForge. Is SourceForge still a thing? Maybe. I don't. It's hard for me to tell. I don't legitimately know.
Yeah, like I think GitHub has definitely been an enabler in fostering an open source ecosystem, and I'm looking forward to see what GitHub can do to basically take that to the next level with services and other great things on top, right? Something that is not strictly related to this, like a personal thing that I've started spending some time thinking about, is really like, what's the impact of machine learning for front-end and web developers? I think we're seeing a lot of interesting things where we're seeing like production-grade code being written from a sketch file by an ML. And I think that is going to be a whole different perspective we're going to apply on the world of front-end and tooling in general, that we're going to see like MLs being able to accelerate and simplify a lot of our daily workflows. So I'm quite curious about that space, and that space is so new, and we don't know where it will be in 6 months or 5 years from now. But I think that's going to be really, really interesting.
And yes, SourceForge is still a thing.
True.
Well, again, like, I think it's an interesting time to be, if you're in the tooling space and you've built tools for things, it's a really interesting time to be around, because like you said, there's, between the ML stuff and sort of the APIs that we've started to get within browsers, and it all has started to gel around. Wow, I can indeed write better tooling than we had, before. And not only that, is that people who weren't necessarily people who wrote tools can now also write their own tooling. We've started to come out with libraries that make a lot of that stuff significantly easier to sort of handle. That gives me a lot of hope overall these days, to be honest, because for a while there it looked kind of grim.
Yeah, and to me, that really comes down to how we open about the web platform. What I love is that we have an open platform, and we have open tooling, and we have open source projects. We all can build on top of each other's ideas, right? I think that's really powerful, and that's something that we don't see in other ecosystems around tooling.
So we're running up against time at this point. Kenneth, have Danny and I forgotten to ask you things? There's probably something there's so many things to talk about. We could sit here and talk all day, but we can't do that. I don't think they'll let us post them at that point. So is there something that we missed that we should have probably talked about when it comes to VS Code or platform, or just something you wanted to say?
Well, I'm a bit disappointed that you didn't ask what's in the new VS Code release that we just released while recording this.
That is true.
I want to read the release notes. That's the one joy. The one joy. No, it's not the one joy, but it's a joy. No. What is new though? I'm curious. What's the nifty thing out of it? What's the thing you like out of the current release?
So our January release that we just released literally 30 minutes ago is that the new key thing is that when you install extensions, so you don't have to reload anymore.
Ooh.
So basically, we have
that's very nice.
And no reload experience for the majority of our extensions. You can just install stuff, and when you need it, and bam, it's enabled. So that lights up. If you install the Vue V2 or the Vue.js experience, you have a Vue file open, bam, you're seeing the IntelliSense and the language server being started up for Vue. So I think that's a really nice experience, and really comes down to how we can take simple things that you can refine the experience and the workflow. Because a lot of developers, they switch between workloads, and maybe for Python they only want some extensions to be enabled or installed, and for others they do, right? So that's just a little thing we're doing, semantic selection. But read the release notes, everything is out there, and have a look.
Well, fantastic. Just so many interesting things going on in Visual Studio Code these days. And it's really great to see, because I think it has improved the experience for a lot of developers out there who had trouble before. Because I think a lot of times we take for granted the tooling we have personally set up, and we just assume everybody must have the exact same thing. VS Code makes that experience way simpler.
Well, I'm glad to hear that some of the work we're doing has value. So that's great.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today, Kenneth. If people want to find you on the internets and the intertubes and things, where would they find you?
By following Auchenberg, that's my last name. It's a bit of a German name, so Auchenberg, Auchenberg. So yeah, tag along. I'm tweeting about everything from VS Code to dev tools to the web platform stuff. So and I'm always open for great debate, whether it's controversial or not. So.
And we'll make sure to get that in the show notes as well. Danny, any closing thoughts before we wrap up episode number 183?
No, but so there are a few things that I will say with absolute confidence, and one of them is that Visual Studio Code is better than Notepad++.
Yes.
I feel like that's kind of an apples to Ferrari comparison there, but okay, I'll give you that.
Nope, make very strong, very vague arguments.
What the internet was founded on.
Yes, correct.
Well, with that, this has been episode number 183 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today we've been talking with Kenneth about Visual Studio Code, things on the platform, dev tools, and all the wonderful things that are happening in those ecosystems. Tune in next week when we talk more things web, more things platform. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Hey.